السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Peace be upon you and God's mercy and blessing. In a television interview in 1983, a former American intelligence officer named Frank Snepp offered a revealing account of his work inside one of the most dangerous institutions in the United States security apparatus, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. Snepp provided an example of how political power influences the media. He didn't speak about direct censorship of the press. Instead, he described a far more sophisticated method, controlling the information itself before it ever reaches journalists. During his time with the CIA in Vietnam between 1969 and 1975, Snepp and his colleagues developed considerable expertise in planting stories in major publications, such as the New York Times, the New Yorker, Los Angeles Times, and Chicago Daily News, in ways that served the CIA's objectives. The process was not based on outright fabrication. Rather, it involved supplying information that was not necessarily false, but only partially true. These half-truths would be leaked to carefully selected journalists through relationships that had already been built on trust. In this situation, the press was not forced to publish anything, but journalists would suddenly find themselves in possession of what appeared to be a major scoop from an official source that was difficult to question. Under the pressure of professional competition, they would publish it. Snepp explained that this method succeeded roughly 70 to 80% of the time, especially when the leaked narrative was reinforced through additional sources. That created an atmosphere of false confirmation and enhanced the credibility of the information. In other words, a journalist would receive a piece of information from one source, then counter the same information through another source. Naturally, the journalist would conclude that the story had been independently verified and would go ahead and publish it. In short, control over the media is exercised not by suppressing information, but by determining what information becomes available, how it is presented, and to whom it is given. As a result, media coverage often becomes a reflection of the narrative that those in power want to promote, even without any direct intervention. The entire process appears to be a triumph of journalistic skill, as though reporters had managed to obtain accurate information from reliable sources and verify it through multiple channels, all without the authorities having any intention of releasing it. At one level, Frank Snepp's interview may suggest that the American media was deceived by U.S. intelligence agencies into disseminating the information the authorities wanted to circulate. In reality, however, the American media is not a victim of power. It is one of the instruments of power wielded by the ruling establishment in the United States. In this episode, we will explore that side of the American media. Despite the polished image it projects, it is, in the end, simply the media apparatus of a political system. Much like the media sectors in the overwhelming majority of Arab countries, where the ruling regime draws the boundaries that the press must observe, and the media's role is essentially to obey. And nowhere did the American media more clearly reveal itself as the media arm of the state than during America's wars against us, the people of this region, and against the countries of the global South more broadly. In 2020, with the spread of COVID-19 or the coronavirus, Cuba strengthened its international presence by sending medical teams to dozens of countries whose healthcare systems were collapsing or severely weakened. More than 50 medical missions were dispatched to dozens of countries, and thousands of Cuban doctors joined the global effort to confront the virus. In doing so, Cuba embodied one of the highest forms of human solidarity. Even before the coronavirus pandemic, thousands of Cuban doctors had spent years working in underserved regions throughout Latin America, Africa, and other parts of the world. We saw Cuban doctors in Indonesia after the 2004 tsunami, in Haiti after the 2010 earthquake, and in Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone fighting the Ebola outbreak in 2014. They also helped build healthcare systems in Timor-Leste and Bolivia. They were working at a specialized ophthalmology hospital where they managed to restore sight to thousands of patients in one of the poorest regions of the Latin American country. Cuban medical teams often succeeded in filling the severe shortages in local healthcare systems. By 2020, the year of the pandemic, the number of Cuban healthcare workers abroad had reached around 37,000 medical personnel operating in 67 countries. The Cuban medical missions were not limited to poor countries either. If we remember, Italy was hit extremely hard during the early stages of the pandemic, and its healthcare system came close to collapse. Nearly all of Italy's allies abandoned it, but Cuba did not abandon its humanitarian role. It sent medical teams to Italy. That initiative was met with both official and public praise in Italy, as well as in the other countries that received Cuban medical teams. But on the other hand, this remarkable humanitarian and solidarity-driven initiative became the target of an American smear campaign. In the American media, the event was not presented as a humanitarian response. Instead, it was framed in a deeply suspicious manner that diminished its humanitarian value, distorted the image of Cuban doctors, and even portrayed them as victims of exploitation or as political propaganda tools meant to publish the image of Cuba, its political system, and the Cuban Communist Party. Some media outlets went so far as to accuse the doctors of being spies in the countries benefiting from cooperation with Cuba. Officially, the United States pursued a demonizing campaign against Cuba's medical programs and pressured countries hosting Cuban doctors to reconsider or terminate their medical cooperation agreements with Cuba. The U.S. even urged some of those countries to reject Cuban assistance during the pandemic. At the same time, the United States intensified its blockade of Cuba to the point of obstructing humanitarian aid from reaching the island at the height of the COVID pandemic. As a result of those sanctions, several international companies refused to sell ventilators to Cuba. Then, in September 2020, again at the height of the pandemic, a bill was introduced in the U.S. Senate aimed at undermining Cuba's medical programs by linking them to human trafficking, thereby opening the door to sanctions against countries benefiting from Cuban medical missions. So how did the American media deal with this criminal conduct by the ruling establishment in the U.S.? Most media outlets simply repeated the government's official accusations. Bloomberg, for example, published an opinion piece on March 23, 2020, titled, "Coronavirus could give Cuba's flying doctors new opportunities, but letting Havana exploit the virus for hard currency will only strengthen repression." Another Bloomberg report published on June 16, 2020, linked the Cuban mission to efforts to earn hard currency and compensate for the island's tourism losses caused by the pandemic. The entire presentation of Cuba's medical program was confined to financial and political motives, with virtually no consideration given to its humanitarian or ethical dimensions. Meanwhile, the Wall Street Journal published an article on March 22, 2020, by Mary Anastasia O'Grady, who is known for her intense hostility toward leftist governments in Latin America, under the title, "Repression in the Time of Coronavirus. With Venezuelan oil and Cuban tourism collapsing, authoritarian rulers race for dollars." In that article, Cuba was described as running slave trade in doctors, turning humanitarian work into human trafficking in complete alignment with the accusations promoted by the U.S. administration. The CNN website also claimed in a report published on March 30, 2020, that Cuba was suffering from a shortage of medical personnel because of its overseas missions. The implication was that the Cuban government was gambling with the lives of its own people in exchange for financial returns. Of course, this argument made no mention of the fact that those revenues were essential to sustaining Cuba's healthcare system, which was itself struggling under U.S. sanctions. Those sanctions had significantly increased the cost of importing medicines, medical supply, and healthcare technology. And beyond the political bias of Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal, it's hardly surprising that they approached Cuba's humanitarian initiatives primarily through the lens of numbers, hard currency, and commerce. After all, these are institutions that represent capital, and more specifically, the most ruthless forms of capital. Within that worldview, it's almost impossible to comprehend the idea of international human solidarity as something entirely separate from calculations of profit and loss. And even the New York Times, which is often presented as more progressive than other American media outlets, was at the forefront of incitement against Cuban medical missions well before the coronavirus pandemic. For example, on March 17, 2019, the newspaper published an article by Nicholas Casey claiming that Cuban doctors working in Venezuela pressured Venezuelans to vote for Nicolas Maduro in the 2018 election. The article alleged that doctors refused to treat patients who supported Maduro's opponents, and that they deliberately went into poor neighborhoods to provide medicine and treatment exclusively to those who voted for Maduro. To understand why there were Cuban medical missions in Venezuela in the first place, it's important to note that the country faced a serious shortage of doctors and healthcare workers in its poorest regions, especially in informal settlements, impoverished suburbs, and remote rural areas. The roots of this problem are social, class-based, political, and also racial, though we will not go into those details today. What matters is that Cuban doctors were providing healthcare services to the poorest people in Venezuela, and the Venezuelan government was covering the costs of that program. It should also be emphasized that Cuba's healthcare system is among the best in the world at every level, from scientific research and medical education to the provision of free or nearly free health care to the entire population. And when we speak of Cuba's scientific achievements, it's important to mention that the country developed 2 vaccines against COVID-19, one of which was called Abdala. Nor was this humanitarian work spared from American smears. In some cases, the media even moved ahead of the U.S. administration itself in demonizing it. What is particularly striking is that the New York Times and Fox News converged in their efforts to tarnish the image of Cuban doctors working in Venezuela. To put this in perspective, Fox News is widely regarded as the American media outlet most supportive of Donald Trump, while the New York Times is commonly seen as one of his fiercest media opponents. In short, the American media, from the far right to the far left, at least according to prevailing U.S. political classifications, remains fully aligned with the foreign policy of the ruling establishment in the U.S., even when those policies take on what the speaker characterizes as an exterminatory or genocidal character, as in the case of the blockade against Cuba. To be sure, some media analysts did acknowledge Cuba's effective domestic response to COVID-19 and the positive role it played internationally. But the overwhelming majority of the American media acted as a partner to the U.S. government in obscuring and discrediting the humanitarian dimension of Cuba's international initiative. The U.S.-based media watchdog Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, an organization dedicated to monitoring media coverage, published a report on May 31, 2020, explaining that the rhetoric directed against Cuban medical teams was part of a broader campaign to discredit these programs. The report also noted that many media outlets relied on narratives that lacked even the most basic verification. It pointed out that publishing allegations that do not withstand minimal fact-checking is the opposite of genuine concern for the working conditions of Cuban doctors. If the American media were truly concerned about those doctors, it would not circulate false or unverified stories about them. Fair concluded that American democracy suffers from a profound structural weakness caused by corporate-owned media, which imposes significant constraints on public debate, including any discussion related to Cuba and, by extension, its medical missions.
لما نحكي عن الإعلام الأمريكي
When the American media is discussed, it's often portrayed as one of the pillars of democracy, a free and independent press dedicated to holding power accountable and uncovering the truth. The same media presents itself as essential to the preservation of democracy. The slogan of the Washington Post, for example, is "Democracy dies in darkness." And when we look more closely at how this media has handled major and highly consequential issues, such as the blockade against Cuba, the earlier sanctions on Syria and Venezuela, the war on Iraq after more than a decade of sanctions, and more recently the war against Iran in 2026, the picture does not merely become more complicated, it changes completely. And not simply because this media displays bias, but because the same pattern of bias tends to repeat itself almost identically each time. First, the particular party is portrayed as a threat or an enemy. Second, the media relies heavily on narratives provided by the institutions of the American state, with little or no skepticism toward those accounts. Third, by contrast, virtually everything said by governments or actors opposed by the United States is treated with suspicion. Fourth, certain aspects of a story are highlighted, while other aspects are marginalized. The broader context of events is either ignored or published to the sidelines. This analysis does not come solely from outside observers. Glenn Greenwald, the American journalist known for his investigative reporting and for publishing documents from the National Security Agency, NSA, offers one such perspective. The NSA, of course, is the U.S. agency specializing in electronic and technical surveillance. Monitoring phone calls, track online activity, hacking cameras, and following people through satellite systems. Greenwald published those documents in cooperation with Edward Snowden, the former NSA contractor who exposed the agency's surveillance programs. Greenwald states plainly that the American media does not merely fail to challenge power, it actively serves it. And as we noted earlier, this assessment does not come from an outside critic, but from someone who worked within major media institutions and understands the relationship between journalism and political decision-making in Washington, D.C. In the same vein, Chris Hedges, who spent many years as an international correspondent for the New York Times and won the Pulitzer Prize, the most prestigious award in American journalism, offers an even sharper critique than Greenwald. Hedges argues that journalism is no longer a tool for holding power accountable. It's become part of power itself. In his view, the media no longer stands outside the structures of authority. It's become part of the same political and economic system that it is supposedly meant to scrutinize. At that time, the central question is no longer whether the American media is biased. The real question is how the bias is produced and why the same pattern reappears again and again, especially when the subject is directly tied to American foreign policy. Norman Solomon, an American journalist and author specializing in media and politics, wrote on April 17, 2003, about a specific and recurring mechanism within the American media. According to Solomon, journalists, despite their different political orientations and the varying institutions they work for, repeatedly allow the political establishment to define in advance the boundaries of public debate and even the limits of acceptable compassion. As Solomon put it, in practice, this is often how it works. Countless journalists, whether flag-waving personalities on Fox News or liberal intellectuals on NPR, continue to allow those in power to determine the boundaries of acceptable sympathy and moral concern. In other words, the problem does not lie only in the content produced by journalists and media institutions. The deeper problem lies in the broader framework within which news coverage is produced, and that framework is one whose boundaries are drawn by political power. In the modern history of our region, one of the clearest examples of this mechanism at work was the American media's coverage of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Before the invasion, the dominant narrative across the American media was the one promoted by the U.S. government itself. It claimed that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, specifically chemical and biological weapons, and that it was developing a nuclear program. These allegations were accompanied by claims of possible ties between the Iraqi regime, the government of Saddam Hussein, and Al-Qaeda, the group responsible for the September 11, 2001 attacks, the deadliest assault on American soil since World War II. These claims were widely adopted by the American press and were often repeated without any meaningful skepticism. A later review by the American Public Television Network, PBS, found that much of what had been reported was based on government sources whose assertions had not been independently verified. After the war, it became clear that virtually all the evidence presented to justify the invasion was false. As a whole, the American media played almost no significant critical role. As a result, public support for the war in Iraq rose to more than 70% in some opinion polls before the invasion began. At one point, more than 70% of the American public supported the U.S. war against Iraq. Once the invasion started, journalists embedded with American forces were required to sign agreements with the United States Department of Defense, binding them to rules established by the Pentagon itself. Across U.S. television networks, the dominant tone was openly supportive of the war. In such an atmosphere, objective reporting was the last thing the media was concerned about. Nor can this performance be separated from the climate of fear and political pressure that emerged after the attacks of September 11, 2001. Norman Solomon, for example, argued that the White House sent journalists an implicit message. If they exercised too much independence, they could find themselves facing criminal accusations of aiding and abetting the terrorist enemy. American journalists such as Bill Moyers and Dan Rather acknowledged that the media's failure to question, scrutinize, and hold officials accountable over the 2003 Iraq War was not merely a professional lapse, it was a political instrument used to pressure American society to support the war and to prevent the public from being exposed to any ideas that might have offered an alternative to military action. Then, 1 year after the completion of the American invasion of Iraq on May 26, 2004, the New York Times published a rare editorial note assessing its own coverage of Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction. The note concluded that the newspaper's reporting had been deeply flawed and had lacked sufficient caution and verification. The editorial board acknowledged that the paper had relied excessively and to a considerable extent naively on intelligence sources whose credibility later proved highly questionable. It also admitted that some claims, which were already controversial at the time, were published without adequate skepticism or sufficient contextual scrutiny. In the same vein, on April 25, 2007, PBS aired as part of the Bill Moyers Journal program a documentary titled Buying the War. The documentary dealt directly with the failures of the American media in the period leading up to the invasion of Iraq. It argued that U.S. media organizations failed in their watchdog role and relied heavily on the narratives and justifications put forward by the administration of George W. Bush, without subjecting them to the professional and critical scrutiny they required. The investigation drew on testimony from journalists and reviews of media coverage. It also highlighted reporting that had questioned the government's claims used to justify the invasion, but which was marginalized and largely ignored. Buying the War explained that misleading the American public before the invasion of Iraq could not have been accomplished by political power alone. It required a complicit media apparatus. The documentary described the pre-war period as a moment of collective professional surrender, in which much of the press abandoned its independence and critical spirit and joined the U.S. government on the march to war. voices that challenged the administration's narrative about the reasons for invading Iraq were not necessarily silenced outright, but they were pushed to the margins. For example, pro-war articles were prominently featured on front pages, while skeptical pieces were relegated to the inside pages away from the eyes of most readers. After the invasion, some journalists and media figures began to acknowledge their professional failures. Even so, according to the documentary itself, the American media had still not fully confronted its role, even years later, in enabling the Bush administration to launch a war based on false pretexts. In one of the most consequential wars our region has endured, a war whose repercussions are still with us today in 2026, the American media in particular, and the media of what calls itself the free world more broadly, failed to perform the critical oversight that should have stood in the way of the invasion of Iraq. More than that, it actively participated in disseminating, promoting, and entrenching the narrative of the American political establishment. And only after the catastrophe had already occurred, after the horse had quite literally left the barn, after an entire country had been devastated, hundreds of thousands of people had been killed, millions had been displaced, and the door had been opened to the destruction of Iraqi society, did the American media begin to review its performance. But even then, it did not do so in the way that it should have. In their 1979 book, The Political Economy of Human Rights, Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman explain how media institutions tied to major financial and corporate interests do not treat massacres simply as human tragedies or as abstract crimes against humanity. Instead, they classify and frame them according to their relationship to American foreign policy. Put simply, some massacres are denounced forcefully by the media when those accused of committing them are enemies of the United States. Other massacres are minimized, marginalized, or even justified when the perpetrators are U.S. allies or actors whose interests align with Washington, D.C. In this sense, the way a massacre is described depends less on the scale or nature of the crime than on political decisions. The same idea appears in The Politics of Genocide by Edward Herman and David Peterson. In that book, the authors argue that the term genocide is often used politically, deployed aggressively against adversaries, while ignored or avoided when the issue involves U.S. allies or American policies themselves. The logic was evident, for example, in American media coverage of Syria during the rule of former President Bashar al-Assad. As the U.S. sought to weaken and ultimately overthrow Assad, killings carried out under his government were presented as horrific massacres, described in highly charged language and accompanied by explicit calls for direct American military intervention. Headlines in The Washington Post, August 23 and August 27, 2012, The New York Times, June 2, 2011, and The Wall Street Journal, June 15, 2012, treated the massacres in Syria as what Chomsky and Herman would describe as worthy bloodbaths. David Brooks wrote in The New York Times on June 2, 2011, that the Syrian government was, quote, one of the most depraved regimes in the world, and argued for a strategy aimed at changing it. An editorial in The Wall Street Journal on June 15, 2012, maintained that Assad's massacres justified an American military campaign. Meanwhile, The Washington Post wrote on August 27, 2012, that the massacre in Daraya reflected a deliberate policy of mass killing, and described the hesitation of the Barack Obama administration as a form of moral bankruptcy. But as the political landscape in Syria changed with the fall of the Assad government in December 2024 and the emergence of a new authority in Damascus that received American approval, the tone of media coverage shifted noticeably. Major Western organizations such as Amnesty International documented killings carried out by armed groups that targeted Syrian civilians, especially religious minorities. This included the killing of around 1,700 Alawite civilians in Syria's coastal region in March 2025, in addition to cases of executions and attacks targeting Syrians from the Druze community. Despite that, American media coverage remained limited and subdued. Major newspapers published only a small number of articles, and the events were often described in vague terms like instability or rising sectarian violence, without clearly highlighting the responsibility of the ruling authority in Damascus. For example, in an article published on March 10, 2025, the Washington Post described the events as a kind of sectarian massacre, but without any call for intervention, unlike what used to happen during the previous government period. Meanwhile, on May 9, 2025, the Wall Street Journal mentioned the slaughter of Alawites and attacks on the Druze only as secondary details. As for the New York Times, in a piece published on May 14, 2025, it presented the situation in vague language that failed to reflect the scale of the crimes or identify those responsible. It even described the violence as recent or new, which is inaccurate because there is already a documented history of violence committed by the groups that seized power in Damascus after the fall of Bashar al-Assad's government. There are disturbing reports showing that factions linked to Jabhat al-Nusra had already committed violations back in 2024. Some of these crimes were openly claimed by al-Nusra and its allies with pride, such as car bombings that targeted civilians or the kidnapping and disappearance of hundreds of civilians, sometimes even displaying them in front of cameras. The shift in language from the era of Bashar al-Assad to the rule of Abu Muhammad al-Jolani's authority, from explicit condemnation to vague or even justificatory descriptions, raises questions about the role of media tied to American foreign policy. Violations committed by Washington's adversaries are treated as crimes demanding mobilization, while violations committed by allies or within a context aligned with Washington's interests are downplayed or at least presented as the result of chaos or sectarian violence with no clear perpetrator. This method of coverage cannot simply be dismissed as incidental. It can be seen as a contributing factor to the violence itself, because such coverage sends an implicit signal that these acts can be repeated. And this reality is already unfolding in Syria, where violations and killings against Alawites continued in different parts of the country. On March 5, 2026, the organization FAIR, which we mentioned earlier, published a report about American media coverage of the American-Israeli war in Iraq. The report showed that U.S. media operated within a clear pattern aimed at reversing the roles of victim and aggressor. Iran was portrayed as responsible for escalation and violence, even though the attack had originally been launched by the U.S. and the Israeli occupation entity at a time when Iran was engaged in negotiations. Instead of focusing on the origin of the strikes and the root cause of the war, attention was shifted toward the Iranian response, as if the response itself were the source of the threat, portraying Iran as a destabilizing force in the region. At the same time, American domestic media focused on creating a sense of fear among the U.S. public about a possible Iranian retaliation on American soil by amplifying the idea of a constant threat even when the evidence being presented was limited or outdated. In practice, this helped redirect the discussion toward the Iranian threat, instead of questioning the origins of the war. In another report published by FAIR on March 30th, 2026, the focus shifted directly to the performance of the New York Times. The report argued that the Times' coverage was not balanced, but rather shaped by a clear disparity in access to information. For example, the newspaper maintained a strong direct presence of correspondence inside the occupied Palestinian territories, inside what is called Israel, while there was a complete absence of reporting from inside Iran itself. The New York Times had no correspondent on the ground, relying instead on phone interviews and content from social media. That difference was directly reflected in the substance of the coverage, which depended heavily on statements from American and Israeli officials. The paper also delayed confirming U.S. responsibility for some attacks that killed dozens of Iranian civilians. In practice, this resulted in amplifying the narrative of one side while marginalizing the reality on the ground inside Iran. Then, on April 10, 2026, FAIR published another report criticizing the justifications offered by the New York Times for that absence, calling them unconvincing, especially since some Western journalists had managed to enter Iran and report from inside the country, including correspondents from CNN and others. The report also argued that the newspaper could have relied on local journalists instead of sending reporters from abroad. The report further pointed out that the unrestricted working conditions demanded by the New York Times as a prerequisite for operating in any country apparently did not apply to Israel. Put more plainly, the Times claims it does not send correspondents to Iran because of restrictions on journalists there, while at the same time it sends reporters to Israel despite the existence of strict military censorship over journalistic work. More importantly, the newspaper itself acknowledged that operating from outside Iran limited its ability to understand daily realities there or gain access to diverse sources. In other words, from the very beginning, the New York Times adopted a framework that presented Iran as a threat and implicitly opened the door to the idea of using force against it, while introducing humanitarian elements that could later be used to justify pressure on Iran. Then, as the push toward war intensified, any clear stance disappeared from the New York Times coverage. This behavior intersected with the broader political silence that often dominates during the preparation phase of wars. After the war broke out, the newspaper did begin publishing criticisms, but those criticisms focused on how the decision to go to war had been made, such as the absence of clear objectives or the failure to involve Congress. The paper never went as far as rejecting the principle of launching the war itself, which remained implicitly justified through the continued portrayal of Iran as a threat. In the end, this sequence shows that a large part, perhaps the dominant part of mainstream American media, instead of operating outside the framework of power, prefers to function within it, whether through dependence on official sources, the way events are framed, or even the kind of criticism that is allowed. The result is that what emerges is not genuine opposition to war, but rather debate confined within the boundaries drawn by the authorities themselves. The mechanism exposed by former American intelligence officer Frank Snepp, which we discussed at the beginning of the episode, clearly overlaps with the argument presented by the French writer Serge Halimi in his 1997 book, The New Watchdogs, which was later revised and expanded in subsequent editions. The book dismantles the common idea of the media as an independent fourth estate and asks a central question: does this image actually reflect reality, or is it simply an appealing narrative hiding far more complex mechanisms that govern the production of information. Halimi starts from the idea that journalism underwent a gradual transformation from investigative journalism into something new that he calls deferential journalism. Instead of confronting power or exposing it, the media's primary goal became preserving proximity to power. Although direct state censorship in the West has declined, Halimi argues that this did not produce genuine media independence. On the contrary, a new form of control emerged, perhaps less visible than before, but far more deeply embedded within the professional and social structure of the media itself. This is where another concept appears, the society of networks, where relationships between journalists, politicians, and economic and financial elites become intertwined within the same social circles. That closeness makes maintaining relationships with decision-makers a priority for the media, and this directly shapes coverage while weakening the role of criticism. The book also discusses another important issue, media ownership. Halimi explains that a large number of media institutions are owned by major industrial and financial groups. And for those corporations, media is not a core business in itself, but rather a tool of influence. Halimi also talks about the gap between a comfortable and influential media elite and the majority of journalists who work under fragile and difficult conditions. This reality reinforces self-censorship among media workers as a way of surviving within their institutions. And this dynamic is reflected in media discourse, especially on economic issues. As a side note, we saw this mechanism almost literally in the way Lebanese media dealt with the economic, financial, and monetary collapse that erupted in 2019, and even in the period leading up to the collapse. The book also points to the existence of closed media circles in which support and promotion are exchanged. A practical example from Lebanon is when a single funding source finances several media outlets at once. The people working in these supposedly different outlets then end up supporting and promoting one another. This behavior is not unique to Lebanese media, but the Lebanese case serves as an example of a broader pattern that, according to Sergei Halimi, reinforces the dominance of a single narrative. To understand how media discourse is formed and how people become convinced by it, we have to ask, specifically in the case of American media, who funds this media and who actually owns these institutions. Media reports, academic studies, and official documents all point to a clear picture. Ownership is heavily concentrated in the hands of a small number of corporations and wealthy individuals. In his 1983 book, The Media Monopoly, researcher Ben Bagdikian warned about the growing concentration of ownership in American media. At the time, around 50 companies control the media sector. With each new edition of the book, the number of owners kept shrinking, until later studies showed that the figure had fallen to only 20 major entities dominating the overwhelming majority of the media landscape. More than 40 years later, a report published by FAIR on February 3, 2026, argued that this concentration had now shifted from traditional media into digital media as well. Because the majority of people now consume news through the internet, digital platforms have become the primary source of information. The report states that in just a single year, more than half of all visits to American news websites went to platforms controlled by 7 families or major corporate groups. Those companies and families own the New York Times, Fox News Corp, CNN, Yahoo, Comcast, which owns NBC, CNBC, and MSNBC, Microsoft, which owns MSN, IAC, which owns People, and the Daily Beast. In short, the concentration of American media ownership in the hands of a limited number of wealthy families, major corporations, and investment funds reflects the deep relationship between capital and power on one side and the media on the other. This is what keeps the independence of the media, especially American media, and its ability to operate free from political, financial, and economic interests under constant suspicion. Alongside Sergei Halimi's argument, which focuses on the financial dimension and networks of influence shaping media institutions, there's also a complementary framework. Indexing theory, or what we might call the filtering theory, to use our own label for it, developed by the American political communications scholar W. Lance Bennett. The theory explains how media discourse becomes politically disciplined. According to it, news coverage tends to frame debate within the boundaries of opinions already expressed by political elites. Put simply, the media does not generate a discussion independent of power, rather it reflects the balance of power within the ruling establishment itself. When there's consensus among the main political actors, coverage tends to reproduce that consensus. In those moments, we end up seeing the polished official image, while the space for criticism narrows and dissenting voices naturally disappear. The space for criticism only expands in rare cases, specifically when divisions emerge within the ruling elite itself. In this way, the pluralism we see in the media does not necessarily mean genuine independence. It is often merely an extension of the diversity that already exists within the political establishment itself. Bennett also points to another important issue. Journalists tend to choose their sources according to those sources' ability to influence policymaking. This behavior strengthens reliance on official sources, meaning sources tied to the ruling authorities, while reducing the visibility of dissenting voices or voices coming from outside the dominant class. From this overlap between Snep's experience, Serge Halimi's analysis, and Bennett's framework, it becomes clear that the influence of power over the media in the United States does not come from a single mechanism. Rather, it's the result of several interconnected layers. First, a level tied to controlling information and directing what reaches the media, as Snep explains. Second, a level connected to market structures and networks of influence, as Halimi shows in his discussion of media ownership. Third, a level concerned with defining the limits of public debate according to the balance of power within the ruling establishment and the ruling class itself, as Bennett explains. Each of these levels does not operate separately from the others. On the contrary, they reinforce and complement one another, producing a media discourse that may appear diverse to the public, but in reality moves within preset boundaries drawn by the dominant class. So from Iraq to Cuba, from Syria to Iran, and to every country targeted by the United States, whether militarily, politically, through media campaigns, culturally, or through sanctions. And of course, we cannot ignore Palestine, whose case would require an entire series rather than just a single episode. What we ultimately see from all of this is that American media is not merely a media apparatus obedient to power and biased toward financial, political, military, and economic elites. It is an organic part of the very system within which it operates. It is not a watchdog, it is not a fourth estate, it is not an independent voice. American media takes societies that are being targeted and turns them into caricatures. Their histories are reduced and distorted, and any context that could explain their positions is erased. Any mistake or isolated incident is magnified until it becomes a global threat. Meanwhile, everything done by the American government or its allies is either justified, minimized, or buried beneath vague terms like complexities and strategic calculations. The end result is a completely inverted picture. The victim, in American media, becomes the accused, while the aggressor is portrayed as someone merely managing a crisis. More dangerous than that is the fact that the media does not simply transmit the narrative of those in power. It actively polices the boundaries of thought itself. The audience is constantly pushed to think only within the framework presented by the media, a framework already drawn by political power inside the corridors of the American administration. So the discussion becomes, according to American law, is this war legal or not? But the question is almost never asked from a human perspective. Is this war morally legitimate or not? Nor does American media seriously ask whether, under international law, such a war is lawful in the first place. In this way, any opinion outside the boundaries set by power is automatically pushed to the margins and rendered nearly invisible. Even when criticism appears, it is usually criticism of form rather than substance. It talks about mistakes in management or weaknesses in planning, but almost never approaches the core issue. Why are American wars happening in the first place? Who decided on them, and on what basis? These larger questions rarely reach the center of public debate because, quite simply, there is an unwritten ceiling for discussion and the media adheres to it with precision. It succeeded in marketing the system's narrative. It succeeded in directing public opinion. It succeeded in reshaping priorities. And it succeeded in turning some of the most dangerous political and military decisions into cold, technical debates stripped of any real accountability. What stands before us in the end is not a media that writes the truth, but a media that reshapes it. Not a media confronting power, but a media following power's orders and moving alongside it step by step. And if we truly want to understand how grand narratives are manufactured, how wars come to be seen as understandable or even necessary, then it is not enough to look only at politicians' statements. We also have to look at the mirrors that constantly reinforce those narratives, the American media itself. See you in the next episode next week, God willing.
نشوفكم بحلقة جديدة الأسبوع المقبل إن شاء الله.